because Columbia is a pretty distinctly Jewish school as far as Ivy Leagues go. There's a book called The Chosen, which is all about how Harvard, Princeton, and Yale excluded Jews. And what you learn in the book is that they used Columbia as the example of what not to do. Too many Jews at Columbia, they said.
Welcome to Quadcast. I'm Ina, your host. Today we're talking to Spencer Davis, a junior in the joint program between the Jewish Theological Seminary and Columbia University, studying Jewish ethics and American studies. He is also the 150th university news editor for the Columbia Daily Spectator, the independent student newspaper at Columbia. Welcome, Spencer.
Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to talk to you. I want to give context to the joint program that you're doing because it is so grueling to be studying at Jewish Theological Seminary and be doing that Columbia curriculum all at the same time.
Yeah, so as you were mentioning, the joint program, you get 2 bachelor's degrees, 2 BAs. So one you get at the Jewish Theological Seminary and the other you get at the Columbia School of General Studies, which is one of its undergraduate schools. So as a result, you have to do 2 core curriculums, one at JTS and one at Columbia, and then 2 majors, one at Columbia and one at JTS. So I decided to do it because I'd gone to Jewish day school my entire life, and really I'd been doing a joint program forever, for as long as I can remember. Going back to preschool and elementary school and going into high school, I was always taking, secular classes while taking Jewish studies classes. And I found the interplay between them really satisfying. I remember specifically in my junior year, I was in a debate league talking at the Junior State of America about abortion. And then I would go back and in my Jewish studies classes, we would talk about contemporary political issues like abortion through a Jewish lens, learning about them through Jewish text. And so the idea that I could continue to do that, continue to experience that interplay at the college level was so unique and incredible. And I've found that interplay really has taken place. For example, I took a class at Columbia called U.S. Intellectual History, in which we learned about, several different New York intellectuals, including, Irving Howe. And then I ended up taking a class at JTS called Jewish Political Identities Through Memoir, in which we read Irving Howe's memoir. So it was so amazing to be able to learn about him on both ends of the institutions and through different lenses, right? One through a Jewish lens and one, of course, through sort of a secular intellectual lens. So that interplay happens all the time, and it is so satisfying.
What do you say to other students out there who have been immersed in Jewish studies, like you were from an early age, who think that this joint program is a backdoor to Columbia somehow?
I mean, I think one of the things they pay attention to in the application process is whether you are trying to use it as a backdoor to Columbia. Right? Of course, you want students who are very interested in the Jewish studies aspects. And it is so great that is then paired with one of the greatest institutions in Columbia. There really is so much interplay that goes on because Columbia is a pretty distinctly Jewish school as far as Ivy Leagues go. There's a book called The Chosen, which is all about how Harvard, Princeton, and Yale excluded Jews throughout their tenure. And what you learn in the book is that they used Columbia as the example of what not to do. Too many Jews at Columbia, they said.
That's really interesting. And so in your joint program, is everybody Jewish, or are some people just very interested in Jewish theological studies?
I don't think the program has ever had a single non-Jew, but every time that I have asked the admissions folks, they said, we're open to it. If a non-Jew would like to join the joint program, they are welcome to. Though, of course, you really have to take 3 classes at each institution per semester. It's 6 classes per semester. It's unique among the joint programs at Columbia because whereas the joint programs with Sciences Po in France or Trinity College in Dublin or Tel Aviv University in Israel, you spend 2 years at the other institution and then 2 years at Columbia. JTS is so close to Columbia that it provides this really interesting kind of interplay between the two. And so you'd have to be really interested in Jewish studies to be able to stand 3 classes per semester for all 4 years of college.
Walk me through like a typical week for you this semester in your junior year when I feel like it's junior year, things are sort of coming to a head. You have to decide whether you're going to be doing graduate programs. You're really deciding what you're going to be doing after college at this point, right? So walk me through your schedule.
I think one of the most difficult parts of the joint program is that really it delays your choice of what you want to
Mm,
do. Whereas if you go to a typical college, you pick a major, you maybe pick two, the joint program keeps a lot of options open to you. So
mhm.
a typical day for me on Mondays, I'll go to a class at JTS. And then on Tuesdays, I go to a class at Columbia, then a 10-minute passing period back to a class at JTS. And then I got to run all the way back to Columbia. And as I'm preparing, looking out into the job market or the internship market, I have to think about, whether I want to devote the rest of my life to Jewish studies and maybe nonprofit Jewish work or going into the rabbinate, or going to law school, becoming a journalist. It's difficult to maintain that level of freedom all the way through your junior year. It makes that choice, I think, a lot more difficult.
When you were in Jewish day school, like through middle school and high school, did you picture yourself then pursuing Jewish studies to this level and degree? And now you're at this crossroads where you might even possibly pursue it as a career.
It really was, much less of a commitment even then in Jewish day school than it is
Mm,
now with the joint program. I have not only done the joint program, but obviously spent copious amounts of time at Hillel and Chabad. I lead reform services at Hillel, and I served as president of Kesher, which is the reform space there. So certainly way more commitment than I think I was expecting, or definitely my parents were expecting.
Tell me about that a little bit, how it fits in with your family and expectations of you.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly an unexpected path for someone such as myself to go down in the sense that we are not a particularly religious family. We grew
Mm,
up, on the secular to reform scale. So for me, Judaism was really always an academic pursuit.
mm,
Whereas other families experienced it at home in a religious, cultural, spiritual sense. For me, Judaism was always associated with text study in school. And I think that the joint program offers that model of, purely text study, purely academic study of Jewish life in a much more meaty way. So that is sort of why I was so excited by it,
yeah.
because I was able to maintain sort of a secular stance in the classroom. It's not as though we're saying a prayer before we learn.
You're studying ethics. Jewish ethics is a great foundation if you want to go into fields like law and policy and maybe journalism too. And I want to pivot to the journalism a little bit because you're in such a unique spot and I want to get your perspective. You're a Jewish student at the Theological Seminary. You're an editor on the paper. You enter college when there's this massive upheaval and Columbia seems to be sort of at the epicenter. How do you cover as a journalist something like that from the point of view of your Jewish identity?
Yeah, as you mentioned, when I got to campus very quickly in the fall of my freshman year, Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th and the start of the war in Gaza. And, as early as October 12th, there were major protests on Columbia's campus, both
Hmm.
a pro Palestinian protest and a pro Israel counter protest. But at the time, I was just a student. I had applied to Spectator. I had applied to the long form magazine known as The Eye, and I had been rejected, right? Just like most clubs at Columbia, they are very selective, and I didn't make the cut. And so I was facing this kind of conflict where, I was really defined in high school by my identity as a student journalist. And all of a sudden, I arrived on campus and there was really newsworthy things going on. And I didn't have an avenue to report on them because I wasn't accepted to Spectator, which was, really the only school newspaper. So I felt this immense weight. I mean, I would hole up in my room and just think, I wish I wish I could report on stuff like this. By the fall of my sophomore year, I was able to join Spectator. And I thought at the time that I had missed the moment. I felt very dismayed by it. I
Mm.
thought that the encampment had already taken place and that campus had calmed down, and that was it. But of course, that year, provided several more pro Palestinian protests as the war in Gaza raged on. And then on top of it, the Trump administration got involved and congressional scrutiny really took a turn. It was once Trump was elected that it became clear that there was actually a larger problem for Columbia, which was its bottom line. There was research funding at stake. And I remember once I realized that, that problem was going to be ongoing and something I was able to report on. And it
Mhm.
sort of culminated in the summer after my sophomore year, having reported for Spectator just under a year at that point, I was able to report on the deal between the Trump administration and Columbia. I broke that news for Spectator. So that was
Tell
a
me
good
about
feeling.
breaking that news.
So when I joined Spectator in the fall of my sophomore year, I found it very competitive in a very satisfying way. In high school, I went to a small, Jewish day school, and I was the student that was most interested in journalism. And I had a wonderful time working with a teacher of mine named Mr. Carpel, who was a freelance journalist and a celebrity journalist. And he taught me everything there was to know about journalism. But finally, when I arrived at Spectator, there was a competitive spirit, sort of a fire under my ass, motivating me to write quickly. I had always taken so long to write. And finally, not only was I competing with other people on Spectator to beat them to the punch on bylines, but I was competing with national newspapers. If the New York Times wrote about this 30 minutes before me, I felt terrible about it. And so there was sort of a thrill when over winter break, I was in Park City, Utah with my family, and my editor called and said, "No, actually, Spencer, you should write about this congressional letter that they just sent to Columbia. We got it on embargo." The Congress sent it directly to Spectator because they said, who do we want reporting on scrutiny against Columbia except the Columbia student newspaper themselves? I was thrilled. What a privilege. But
That's
it
pretty
becomes
amazing.
interesting when you read the congressional reports, what they include in those reports is reporting from school newspapers because they realized that school newspapers were a resource to figure out what anti-Semitic incidents were going on campus. I was just reporting on a peer of mine named Rebecca Massell. We're writing a profile about her. And she wrote just this exceptional enterprise article during her, I guess it would be her sophomore year, about Jewish students feeling unsafe on campus.
Mhm.
And that was used, as evidence in these congressional probes about anti Semitism on campus. It was her reporting that kind of provided the groundwork for a lot of the work that Congress ended up doing. And so when Congress was looking to find people to report on its own scrutiny over these universities, there was no better place to go than the school newspapers themselves.
When you broke that story, how did people react?
I mean, what's interesting is that, throughout the semester, we learned in March, right around the time that a Columbia student named Mahmoud Khalil got detained, that the Trump administration had cut $400 million from Columbia. And so by the summer, there had been, trickles of a deal. There's a conservative publication known as the Washington Free Beacon that
Mhm.
has, sort of airtight White House sourcing because the White House trusts that they will write the stories with the spin that they are looking for. And
Mhm.
so I sort of kept my eye on the Washington Free Beacon every day while I was studying art and music humanities in Paris, thinking, when is this deal going to drop? Because the Free Beacon's going to get it first. And so every morning they would kind of put out a story explaining, oh, the Trump administration met with Columbia today. And I would call Columbia's PR office and I would say, hey, is it the case that you guys are meeting with the Trump administration? And they'd say, no, Spencer, there's no deal yet. So I'd put out an article. The Washington Free Beacon says this, Columbia says this, the New York Times says that. It was tough because, although I was reaching out to the lawyers representing Columbia and the Trump administration officials representing the Trump administration, they do not want to spend their time speaking to a student journalist. They
Right.
have better ways to spend their time. So I was really riding off the coattails of other journalistic institutions,
Mhm.
primarily, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Free Beacon. And so I would end up sort of piecing together sourcing from those different outlets. Finally, on a random night, it's probably 6 a.m. in Paris, we get news that Columbia has signed its deal with the Trump administration. And I called my friend Emily Pickering, who I'm now co-editors of University News with, and I said, let's write this thing. And all the meanwhile, the president of Columbia called my editor and said, let's do an interview right here, right now. We just signed the deal with the Trump administration. So simultaneously, we're waiting for edits from our editor. What are they up to? What they were up to was interviewing the president of Columbia. And that was, mind you, the very first interview that acting president Claire Shipman had done since taking office. So a
I didn't
real
realize
kind of
that.
moment for the institution.
I mean, you spend a lot of time trying to get information from Columbia. You recently wrote an article about the NYPD having identified those two ICE agents masquerading as NYPD. You tried to get the footage from the school. I mean, what's it like trying to wrestle this information out of a giant institution like Columbia?
Columbia does not like to release information publicly.
Hmm.
It becomes a real battle to get information out of them. And the story that typifies that is the story that you brought up. So Columbia has a student named Eli Agayeva. She's an influencer on Instagram. And one morning she is detained by ICE in her dorm. What was so interesting about that is that the day prior, Columbia students had protested against ICE. And they said Columbia should stop being complicit with ICE.
You're like the most perfect and also most extreme example that I can think of why you can't separate a Columbia experience and campus from New York City. It's just not possible. I do want to go inside campus life and ask you about being in a fraternity at Columbia. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so when I got here freshman year, a lot of people at JTS advised me that joining student groups is really your avenue to finding friends at Columbia. Columbia is a collection of small communities, right? It is a bunch of small communities placed kind of next to one another. We don't
Hmm.
necessarily have a collective school spirit in the way
Hmm.
that a big state school might. And so I sought those kind of specific small communities to try to make friends beyond the 50-person year that I was in at JTS. And so one of the first communities that I found was this fraternity. It was a Jewish fraternity called Alpha Epsilon Pi. At Columbia, fraternities feel like just another part of social life. One of the things that happens at a typical state school is that fraternities will be very territorial. If you are not a member of the fraternity, you cannot go to that fraternity's party. The idea is
Really?
preserving a certain ratio of girls and guys,
Uh-huh.
right? You want more girls. You don't want as many guys. You're only going to let in the guys in your fraternity. Columbia doesn't have such a rule, hard and fast rule against letting guys into fraternity parties. And so what the fraternity really offers you by joining at Columbia is just an immediate group of friends, and particularly a mentorship opportunity. Whereas it's tough everywhere else on campus to meet older students, fraternities have built into them this big little system where
Hmm.
you have an older student who becomes your de facto mentor. And so I found it super wonderful to kind of meet an older student and learn how they navigated campus.
I also know that you take advantage of the city and what the city has to offer. I don't know how you find the time, but you somehow manage. Tell me about your favorite spots in the city, what you like to do.
There's an app called BELI, BELI,
Uh-huh.
where students can rank restaurants against one another. It's like a this or that model, right? So you put two restaurants on there and it says which one was better. And so a lot of students find using BELI very social. They like kind of going onto their friends' profiles, seeing which restaurants they tried, and then going out and trying those. And so that's
Mhm.
been my absolute favorite part. One of my favorite stories was, I was out late one night with some fraternity brothers of mine, and we wound up at Lincoln Center getting a walk-in at the New York Times #1 rated restaurant at the time.
What was it?
It's called Tatiana and it's by a guy named Chef Kwame, kind of a celebrity chef, restaurant at Lincoln Center. And so, like, what a privilege, right? To be a college student wandering around your college town with a bunch of your fraternity brothers and to wind up at the New York Times #1 rated restaurant. So that was a very special experience. But in general, I love right near campus a restaurant called Wu and Nussbaum that serves bagels in the morning and Chinese food in the afternoons.
Wow, I
Um,
love that. I love that
yeah,
combination.
it's awesome. I mean, around Columbia, there is a really great kind of broad spectrum of different restaurants from different cultures. And then obviously accessing the city, particularly Chinatown is one of my favorites. Obviously, I'm on a student budget. So whatever I can do to find cheap meals, I do. And Chinatown always offers that.
Spencer, do you recommend your program to other students who have an authentic interest in Jewish studies and, studying it deeply, maybe on a secular level? Would you do it again if you could?
It is certainly a lot of work to get
Yeah.
2 degrees, and as a result, you have less time available to you to, take advantage of social opportunities or take advantage of extracurriculars. You
Hmm.
are truly committing to doing 2 full degrees. That being said, it is the greatest opportunity of all time, and I would recommend it 1,000 times over because it really is such a special experience to be able to learn from top faculty at 2 different institutions simultaneously.
What are some of the options you're considering for your future?
I'm certainly considering law school. Obviously, studying Jewish ethics and American studies leads you down a path like that. I've
Mhm.
taken a lot of different law school type classes, including one with the former president of Columbia, President Bollinger, who taught a class about, the
Mm.
First Amendment.
Yeah, he has a lot to say about what's happening now between Columbia and the federal government.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I interviewed him shortly after having taken the class. He called out of the blue after we emailed him because, we were seeking an interview with him because he had written a book called University: A Reckoning. And so
Mhm.
it was a real privilege to be able to interview him immediately after having taken the class. He was such a gift as a professor because he was so knowledgeable about the
Mhm.
subject matter that he would walk into class and ask his TA, "What did I speak about last time?" and sit down and speak for an hour straight about a new legal topic completely off the dome. I mean,
Mhm.
it was really incredible to watch. And he was, fluid and understandable. And since then, through my Spectator relationship, we've certainly kept in touch. And then actually, a friend of mine named Ruby ended up interviewing him for a second article we wrote about Jeffrey Epstein's attempt to donate $50 million to Columbia's dental school, which
I
President
remember
Bollinger
that.
rejected.
Really?
That's right. It was a big enough donation, being $50 million, that it would have required, or at least implied, naming the school after him. And
Mm.
President Bollinger, aware of Jeffrey Epstein's 2008, conviction for
Mhm.
soliciting prostitution of a minor, rejected that donation.
Has your view of your future changed since you started the program?
Yeah, I'm certainly more realistically considering rabbinical school because of my enjoyment of studying Jewish texts
Hmm.
and Jewish ethics and the like. But also my experience at Spectator has really made me seriously consider journalism.
Hmm.
So whereas before the program, I think I would have told you 1,000,000,001 times over that I was going to law school, now I have other paths in consideration. It's made my choice much harder.
Is there anything at all that you wanna promote? Here's your
Read
chance.
Spectator. Read the
Good.
Columbia Daily Spectator. I think we put out great coverage, and being an editor, I get to see the work that every single person puts into their articles. And I'm really proud to say that I, contribute to an environment like that.
That's wonderful. I thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of these really smart insights and experiences.
Thanks for having me.